Hello, and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's research and policy podcast, where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to those elders on the lands from which you may be joining us today. I'm your host, Emma Dawson, and this week we're joined by my friend Emeritus Redmond Barry Professor Janet McCalman for our episode regarding Per Capita's new report, The Way In, looking at the 47th Parliament. It's the third report in a series which examines the backgrounds of elected members of the federal parliament. It follows our analysis of the 45th and 46th federal parliaments, and on this episode, Janet will help us unpack our findings around educational pathways into the 47th parliament. Janet, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
The demographic makeup of government is becoming more and more important as it comes under scrutiny by people who are losing faith in democratic institutions. Representation matters, and that's why we do this analysis of every federal parliament. When we look at education, it's a particularly interesting picture in Australia. In most developed nations, education is considered a clear indicator of social and economic class, with those attending private schools coming primarily from wealthy backgrounds. Janet, how does education become a factor of the class divide in Australia?
It was a factor from the very beginning. So depending on which colony, the colonies all were different in the way they approached education. So New South Wales started very early with state high schools, something like 70 years before Victoria did. So what's significant about Victoria, which has been a very powerful state politically, is that private schools from the beginning sought to protect the middle class, and they were church schools which were sought to protect the congregations and the memberships of the church. So the great battle in Victoria was between church and state, and when they brought in free, compulsory and secular education in 1872, that was a very strong, progressive ideal. And the churches resisted joining the state system. So ever since then, state schools were residual schools for those who didn't have the money to go to private school if they were Protestant. And within the Catholic system, there was a hierarchy, schools that were glamorous and schools that were for the workers. So the schooling does absolutely shape your social class, and it's a way parents bought a class membership for their children.
So this is really interesting because, as you know, when after the recent UK election, there was quite a lot of interest, and I think rightly so, in the fact that the Starmer government there now has only one privately educated MP in its cabinet, and in the UK that was seen as particularly newsworthy given the previous Conservative government's dominance by old Etonians. But in Australia, we find things are a little different. So only 57% of secondary school students in the Australian community go to government schools. That proportion's much higher in the UK. And here we have 20% in private independent schools and 23% in Catholic schools. But one thing we found when we looked at the background of our current parliament is that in the Labor Party and the Greens, there are slightly more representatives that went to public school than in the general population, but significantly fewer in the coalition and amongst independents. How much or whether at all private schools should be publicly funded, of course, is a big contentious issue in Australia. And it's obviously something that people feel very strongly about. There's a great deal of concern at the moment about the brouhaha over the proportion of federal government and state government spending going to public schools. And we know that private schools, particularly independent private schools, tend to be overfunded according to the Gonski model, and public schools underfunded. But I don't think we really understand the implications of people's educational background, not just in how they may approach the school funding issue, but how they approach politics overall. What's your general view of that, of how education has played out, not just through history, but how it might influence decision making?
your schooling and the identity of the school you go to shapes your identity for life. And it's very much in terms of your position in society. So by going to a prestigious and expensive Protestant private school or to a prestigious Catholic school, you've bought your way into the elite without having done anything to deserve that. So therefore, already you've got that identity, which if you become a progressive, you spend the rest of your life trying to deny. so, um, and there are plenty of people who went to very posh schools who became very progressive and important leaders. And in the Labor side, I mean, a lot of them were at these schools because they were scholarship winners. Now, the brute fact of this, that when we did a study a long time ago for my book Journeyings on the Middle Class, Mark Peel and I analysed where everyone went to school in 1988. So it was who went where in Who's Who 1988. And what we found was a huge difference between New South Wales and Victoria, where New South Wales, having had selective high schools very early, those selective high schools were delivering a cohort of people into public life who had a different background from those in Victoria. So in Victoria, the idea was that the state would provide basic education and education for which might enable you to go to university would be the preserve of private schools, and that what they call junior government scholarships were the means by which the clever but poor could go to that through that path to university. And that's an extremely important part of the Victorian story. So those scholarship systems did enable children to move up socially, and a lot of the sort of people who become active in public life have that background of being a scholarship kid. Equally, the private schools offer huge numbers of scholarships. It's a major investment in results fodder to bring in the bright kids who will make them look good when the results come out. So nearly all the students who are featured in the newspapers about having this wonderful ATAR at whatever school are a scholarship winner. And the scholarships was a real business where people were prepared in the central schools. My father was in a scholarship class at Mont Albert Central, went for a scholarship. My grandfather was in a scholarship class at Spring Street in Hawthorne, went to Scotch. I went to MLC on a scholarship. 3 generations in the family, because that was the only way you could get into a good school before really the 1980s.
Fascinating, really, to look at this history. I don't think people fully understand the complexity of the education system in Australia between the states, because we do have this debate, don't we, that says all private school bad, public school good on the left, and we tend to try to import a lot of that categorisation of people that comes from overseas. So the scholarship elements are really interesting. I mean, I myself went to a Catholic girls' school, but not on a scholarship, but it was a little bit later than that. So we found that, for example, the number of Labor parliamentarians in this parliament that went to Catholic schools is relatively low compared to the population. It's about 5% behind. But the cabinet, when you look at the cabinet, then in the Albanese ministry, more than a third of the ministry went to Catholic schools, roughly half to government schools, and only about 15% to non-government, which is quite the flip from the shadow cabinet. Why is it then that so many of those high-performing cabinet ministers went through the Catholic system? Do you think it's a reflection of those scholarship kids?
Well, in the Catholic system, they also had scholarships, but they'd be less so now. I mean, I think in the deep past, if you were very clever and working class, it was better to be born a Catholic than to be born a Protestant, because the Catholic Church was talent hunting, often ready to recruit people into religious life. But if you had showed promise, then you often got a chance. And so St. Kevin's Melbourne was set up to provide a pathway through the Christian Brothers to get to university. So, the Catholic system is doing what it is. What's significant about this Parliament now is the shift of Catholics to the Liberal Party. So that's what the big change is, because there were hardly any Catholics in the Liberal Party of Robert Menzies, probably none. And Philip Lynch was the first Catholic Liberal cabinet member. So the most dramatic shift has actually been the move of Catholics. And, some people argue that the DLP was itself a function of that, where Catholics had been felt impelled to be Labor after the divisions over conscription in 1916 and 17, and the pressure, particularly in Victoria, to identify with Labor as a Catholic. One of my friend's father remembered her grandfather saying, "Oh, Archbishop Mannix ruined everything." And then when her grandmother was in the Liberal Party, people were shocked that there was a Catholic member of their local Liberal Party branch, and she had to defend herself, saying it's perfectly normal for someone to be voting Liberal if they're Catholic. So that's the big change, is that the Catholics have moved into the conservative politics, and the identification, as Albo says himself, I had three things I was brought up to believe in: the Catholic Church, the Labor Party, and the Rabbitohs. That is a past generation, and partly to a function in the cabinet of age. So you've got older, more experienced parliamentarians who go into cabinet usually. So they were educated a bit earlier. The people coming in fresh are a new generation. So that's the very big change in Australia, is the changing position of Catholics, that they've now become assimilated right across society. They're no longer obliged to identify with Labor. They can now express their inner Liberal self with impunity.
Well, I mean, our figures do find that. So only 17.4% of the current Labor parliamentarians went to Catholic school, 27.5% of coalition, so a full 10% more there. And when you look at the cabinet breakdown, there are as many MPs from a Catholic school background in the Dutton Shadow Cabinet as there are from government schools. So it's about a 30 split to government, 30 Catholic, and 40 to private independent amongst the Shadow Cabinet. Interestingly, we don't have any Greens MPs that went to Catholic schools.
No, that's interesting. I mean, the number's very small. So
yes, it is.
So I'm not clear to have a theory about them on that, but yes, I would think that sort of makes sense. But the thing, thinking about private schools and their place in Australian society, is that they've been deeply important, and in a funny way, more important than they are in the UK. Because in the UK, it's just confined to the Tory elite. You don't find Labor people who've had a chance to go to Eton, really. They're only on a scholarship. So this is just telling you about the solidity of the Conservative elite. Because the thing that dramatically changed England was the 1944 Education Act and the development of 11 plus and the grammar schools. So that's the transformative educational reform that opened up opportunity in the UK. And so in that way, in a strange sort of way, there was more opportunity in the UK than there was here. And certainly amongst academic friends from the UK, who came in as working class kids to Cambridge or to Oxford, they had to change their accent. They've been able to move fairly seamlessly into the professional academic middle class. So here, there's fewer who come directly from working class backgrounds in universities, but they are, if they do come through that, of the older generation, they came through some critical scholarships. So this is where government policy is so important. because older listeners will remember the state secondary teaching studentships, which, so when I started university, you went for one of those or you went for a Commonwealth scholarship. If you went for a teaching studentship, you got a salary while you were a student. So for a working class family, that meant that child was earning already at 18. You had a bond of 3 years at the end of it, and people didn't like that, but, they coped. And that injected a whole new class of people into university and into the professional middle class. And I think if 20 years ago, if you'd asked the Melbourne University Academic Board, which has all the professors in it, how many of them got to university because they had a secondary studentship, you'd be astonished how many. So that was the pathway that a kid from working class suburbs who did science might end up a professor of biochemistry.
Yeah, do those pathways still exist, Janet, through the private sector, private school sector?
Private sector. Well, the point is that the pathway, the places at the top are now very constricted. This is one of the reasons for the unhappiness of young people and the appeal of sort of left populism and rage, because all the opportunities have been closing down. And it's closing down simply because there are too many people wanting to get into too few spots. So there's not as though the number of professors expands with the population ready to be wanting to be professors, or the population who've got PhDs. It doesn't. It stays about the same, and the number of aspirants gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So you've got a different sort of problem today. So people do law, but they can't get into practicing law. The law degree becomes a pathway to something else. Certainly in the law, to have not gone to a good school is still a huge disadvantage. So I'm thinking of someone telling me of a daughter-in-law who has an Italian background, went to a Catholic girls' school of great antiquity but no social status, who came top of law at Melbourne University and couldn't get articles anywhere.
Even with the top of her field.
Went to the wrong school and she was Italian.
And that's in Melbourne?
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. So
this is the reality that in certain things like the law, getting a position, you've got to have family contacts, or you've got to be the top student, or you've got to have been to a top school, preferably a private school, or to McRobertson Girls High or Melbourne High or Uni High. So there are certain professions where it's very, very tight. In medicine, no, because that's much more purely on academic merit and personality. So today, people are selected for entry to medical school not just on their marks, but on their suitability to be for clinical medicine. So they're interviewed now, and they have tests for whether they've got the right sort of brain to do the job. Because they were finding they were getting students who were incredibly good SWATs, but they started their clinical year and stood in front of a patient and went to pieces. So they couldn't do that.
No bedside manner whatsoever.
So what's happening? I mean, what Melbourne University for a long time has had a quota for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And what happens within the university, and I did actually study my students, is that those who went to very highly regarded and expensive and prestigious private schools did less well at university than you'd expect, and that their ATAR had been inflated by all the value adding that had gone on from their teachers. And the students across the board who do much better at university come from high schools, and particularly country high schools, who've learned to work on their own and to be self-starting. So that's the sort of pressure point at that level. But to get into politics, now we have the party machines which deliver people into politics. Now, in some ways, that's very narrowing. On the other hand, I keep thinking of what Gough Whitlam used to say about being a politician, being a parliamentarian was a profession, a vocation in itself. how do you prepare someone for that vocation? And so that's something we're thinking about.
I want to talk a bit more about tertiary education, but before we do, you mentioned there the Melbourne High, McRobertson Girls High, University High, the selective entry public high schools in Victoria. Of course, Sydney has a great many more of those, and you touched on this early in the conversation. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? And again, it's about the way that those schools were developed in the different states, but how you see that playing out in terms of who has access to power?
Well, those schools, I mean, it's a shock to look back and discover how few high schools there were. And so Melbourne High was a co-ed school originally, known as the Melbourne Continuing School, which was in Spring Street on the site of the College of Surgeons. And that was built quite early, and that was to train teachers. It was only in 1908 they got permission to be able to prepare people for university matriculation. That they just had the teachers to do that, and they were told not to do it because this had to remain the preserve of the private schools. And so the teachers began to prepare students secretly. So it's not until 1908, Melbourne having been founded in 1835, that there was a government school to prepare people to enter university.
Wow.
In Sydney, I think Fort Street starts about 1840.
Right.
But more tellingly, if you look at New Zealand, at Christchurch or Dunedin, those settlements had co-ed high schools within 10 years of settlement, and those schools still exist. So it's something about the whole mindset of the people who set up Australia, where I think from the beginning they were much more anxious about maintaining class differences. If you've got this stigma, which Australia had as a convict penal colony, and you've got all these terrible people at the bottom of society, you want to make sure that people see that you're not like them. So the class as a business, and that's what schools are in, they're in the business of manufacturing social class. There's no other excuse for that, other explanation. They were also in the business of ensuring that people stayed within the faith. And the great push in Victoria to build a Catholic education system rose in reaction to the alarming fact that in the frontiers and the starting of the colony, people were intermarrying, and they wanted to make sure that people didn't marry the other side. I mean, that was the ultimate sin. So the idea of separate schooling became necessary to keep the flock. Now, that's something quite natural to religious organisations. So the Jews have done it, the Muslims are doing it, and that the capacity of religious groups now to start new schooling systems, we can thank John Howard for. It's probably not good for social cohesion. And the Muslim schools are starting to do very well. They're getting very good academic results. The Jewish schools have been stunning. But is this good? No, in my opinion, because what we've ended up with, the country that prides itself on being egalitarian and the fair go and everyone gets a shot, we have the most unequal education system in the OECD. And the fact that our academic results show there's actually a wide divergence in the level of literacy and numeracy, which comes from the fact that our whole education system is highly stratified, and you've got a form of apartheid going on. So middle-class parents panic if their mortgage payments are so big they won't be able to afford the fees that they imagined they'd be able to afford. Because if their child goes to a state school, in those state school, there are all sorts of monsters who are going to bring their child down, particularly if they're migrants. Now, this is the sort of racism that's playing out very strongly in the inner suburbs, where now white middle-class people are coming in contact with migrants. So you have schools that have got very large numbers of children from, say, public housing estates, and nobody in the community will go there.
I find that extraordinary.
So this is the white flight. So, I mean, we're all going to be very nice about schools, but this is the reality. On the other hand, Catholic school system was left with and bore the major burden of dealing with all the migrants when they came after the Second World War. And you'll have known, I mean, people have got memories of sitting in classes of 120 with a poor young nun in charge just taking the role. And so certainly the state schools also were doing all the migrant teaching of the parents, but it was the Catholic system that had the huge numbers, and they were getting no government assistance at all then. So the battle over state aid was that this part of the Catholic system was carrying a huge burden for the community and not educating, couldn't educate children properly. You don't learn to read in a class of 120. So, we do have a problem of adult low functional literacy amongst the older generation. It was just impossible to learn. So those schools needed money. The Labor Party left was opposing it on ideological grounds. And then what happens? Menzies sees an opportunity. He brings in state aid. He gets the Catholic vote to start to move over to the Liberals. But what he does, just like John Howard, he does it in such a way so that the bulk of the money actually went to the schools that were already well off. So what we've seen is comparatively small schools run by religious orders for girls, convents, become enormous and immensely rich and building extraordinary buildings and facilities on taxpayers' money. Now, that hasn't benefited society. It's only benefited a small number of parents. So, what's happened is that we were stuck historically with a divided system, and we now use government money to subsidise inequality.
So
the difficulty, it's like housing. No one's going to give up their privilege to fix this.
And I think one of the reasons that we do this work and we look at educational background is partly because it is one of the closest things we have to a class delineator. But one of the questions that we often get is, well, is it because so many parliamentarians went to private school that they won't touch the funding mix? My view of that tends to be you look at where they send their own children rather than where they went themselves, because very few 5-year-olds have any say over where their parents decide to send them to school. But that's not the kind of information that's publicly available. I don't think we should expect parliamentarians to tell us where their children go to school. There's a real privacy and security issue there. But the fact that half of the current Labor Party cabinet, or the current cabinet, went to a public school, and that slightly more Labor and Greens MPs went to public school than the average, does show us, doesn't it, that there's still at least an attempt by those parties to represent people from lower income backgrounds.
Yes, I think that's so, and that, well, it's how people select themselves to be involved in politics. But the other interesting thing about the Liberal Party is that it in itself, it is an instrument of upward social mobility. So what's interesting about Liberal MPs at the state level, perhaps rather than federal, is how many of them are upwardly mobile and have actually come from quite difficult backgrounds. And so they're the ones who champion, it's all about the individual. If you work hard enough, you can get whatever you want, which is quite a dangerous mentality for a politician because it's very judgmental of others. So, politics is a way of, I can see it here in the inner city with the way the Greens work with the African community. And there are young people who attach themselves to the Greens, even though the Greens are not actually able to do anything for them politically. But what they are giving them is some sense of belonging to Australian society, and with a bit of cachet to it, that they're getting they're getting social status out of it, so that they can feel they get flattered and they get given internships, and a lot of them wake up after a while that nothing has come of it. But that they don't want, they could have come themselves from very conservative families, and they don't want to associate with Labor because it's common. This sort of thing about Labor being common and Liberal being for people who are winners and Greens for being for people who are culturally superior are very powerful drivers of political affiliation. And so one of the things that the Liberals, because they're upwardly mobile, they're actually, as a group, not very well educated at a tertiary level and not very bright. So, to be honest with you,
All
if you're an
opinions
ambitious
expressed on
young...
this podcast are Janet's own.
Yes, I know, but they're not very intelligent. There's some clever lawyers. Christian Porter was obviously a clever lawyer. Malcolm Turnbull was obviously very bright, but there's not many outstanding minds amongst them. Now, in Labor, over the years, there have been some extraordinary intellects in the Labor Party. Ben Chifley was one.
Absolutely.
Curtin was one. Hawke could have been, but he squandered his talents. Keating certainly was, and of course Whitlam. And so people who were very widely read. And the thing that may distinguish Labor politicians who got to the top was that they were self-educated. Now, okay, you can do a degree, but it doesn't mean you know anything.
That's right.
But it's the additional reading you've done and the thinking and the learning and putting into practice what you're reading and learning, and learning from life experience, and again, feeding that back. That's what makes a really good mind for politics.
Yeah, I agree completely with that, and it's a very hard thing to measure. We don't say how many books do you read and what do they tend to be, and I think.
Can I suggest a question in future, which is to what extent your preferred reading is political biography or autobiography? That's one of the alarming things about politicians' private libraries, I find. They're overburdened with the life stories of great men. Increasingly they'll be of great women, but, I think that's just a little bit off.
They don't tend to be terribly illuminating reads, I have to say. People tend... It's very much, this is what I want you to think about me. It doesn't show you it.
Yeah, yes, of course. But, that's all about the success of the individual in politics, not of a movement or a party or about what's happening to society and to the world, which is what politicians are meant to be thinking about rather than their own career.
Moving on a little to tertiary education, we find that the 47th Parliament's probably the most educated in our history. We've got a significant proportion of parliamentarians, about 30% now, with a postgraduate degree. And in terms of a bachelor's degree, we've got, I think, about 85% have at least one of parliamentarians have at least one post-school qualification, which is significantly higher than the general population. Some people are scathing of this, say that it represents a professionalisation of politics and a lack of diversity. And certainly when we did the original study of the 45th Parliament, we compared it back in 2018, we compared it to 1988, so 30 years earlier, and found there were much more parliamentarians at that time with just a leaving certificate or even their HSC, but that hadn't gone on to higher education. That's a function of a shift in society as much as anything else. What's your view of the educational, elite argument that we don't want these highly educated people that are out of touch running the country?
Well, this just depends on whether you regard being highly educated automatically makes you out of touch. It needs not, and so you might be a very in-touch person who is also highly educated. And I think it is remarkable that the Economics Committee of the Labor government has got 3 PhDs from top international universities, from Yale, Harvard and Oxford. That's extraordinary. And they're just the economics
Yes.
committee. So that's how you want to be using your academic
Yes.
brains.
It is much clearer, I have to say, appearing before that committee now than it was under the last government.
Yes, I should think so. The point is that a lot of things about government and politics are very difficult. And the intellectual task of managing, going through all of that legislation, understanding it, working out the ramifications and the bits and pieces. I mean, Jackie Lambie's been honest and says she finds it too much.
Yep.
And indeed, the Teals, behind their complaint, they didn't have enough help, was that they're actually finding it a heavy intellectual burden. It is difficult. And you can't go around saying, oh, you shouldn't have capable people in a
No.
job because that looks bad. The job is difficult. You don't want people being doctors or working as doctors who are trained to just give injections.
No.
So, just a lot of things do require high level of training. And I mean, having a PhD doesn't make you a genius, and being a genius doesn't make you a good politician. The qualities that make a good politician are very complex and everything to do with personality and character, imagination, sympathy, empathy. Look where Morrison got with an empathy deficit. But it's having that sort of imagination as much as anything. But at the same time, you need to have a forensic ability to analyse legislation. So Julian Hill, for instance, is a very good parliamentarian because he's got a forensic legal mind that can take things apart. And you need people like that in your party and your government.
You need a mix.
At the same time,
Yeah.
sorry.
We need a mix.
Yes, you need a mix. Well, you're going to say you need a mix, and you do. And I often think that people deride Labor people from having come from trade unions. Well, being a trade union official is a fantastic training for politics because you're dealing with policy, but you're also learning the arts of negotiation, which are fundamental to politics. You're also learning the arts of working with people and leading them and listening to them and representing them. You learn all of that in being a union official. You don't learn that being an accountant in the suburbs.
No, and that was the great contrast, if I may say so, between Hawke and Howard. The great skills that Hawke brought to the Parliament, of course, were his ability to negotiate, to bring people together, to do deals across different constituencies, but to manage people and manage cabinet. Whereas the Howard government was a lot more top down in that regard, I think.
Yes, I think that's very so. I mean, a friend from here worked for a long time for Simon Crean, and he remembered seeing that there was an issue that Simon had to explain to someone that was going to be difficult, and he took the call, and this chap walked in 2 hours later expecting it to be long gone. Simon was still going, patiently going through everything and explaining and getting people on board. And he said that makes a true politician.
I think
listen and work with people. Now, those are the skills that you are more likely to learn in a union. You're also going to learn them more likely as a teacher. Mates often learn them, in much legal work. And in any job where you are trained to work as a team, I think that might be much more of a. I mean, I find in the university that the people from the medical faculty and from science, they've all been trained to work in teams. Whereas those of us who come from humanities, we're individualists. And so it gets very difficult to, we're cats that have to be herded. And so the meetings take much longer because everyone's got to have their own say. And there's a tiny nuance in their position on something which must be expressed at length, whereas the doctors will find a shared position very quickly because, they're trained to make quick decisions in extremis, and it's life or death. bang.
My late father-in-law used to complain that there weren't enough engineers in Parliament anymore, because engineers not only problem solve, but they do so collectively on difficult, complex issues. And I think it's fascinating. We do look at vocational background in another part of the report, and we'll have a conversation about that on another recap. But I think that the important thing about this project and looking at the backgrounds of parliamentarians is it allows us to sort of delve a little bit below some of the sensational stuff. They're all an elite group. Once they get to Parliament, of course, they are by definition an elite group. But it's really about what kind of background they came from, who they grew up with, who they connected with. And I think if I can return to a point you made earlier on about, what you call white flight, middle class flight from the public school system, I find it really interesting not interesting is a euphemism for distressing, actually, that so many parents of middle class kids wouldn't seek to give them a more rounded educational experience, an experience of a school that is more diverse and has those kids from the housing commission towers as well as the wealthy middle class.
Well, the fear is that their English will be held back. So that's the thing, rather than being a two-way exchange. But the real loss to the nation is that if you're not educating people in your government system, they're not. What's the thing about the state system is that it's a democratic system. So in fact, half the population is not being educated in institutions that are provided by the public purse, which are government, which have secular values. Instead, they're being educated in sectarian spaces where we are different, we are superior to others because we are morally better. And the whole argument in Victoria over the years about private schools, and this came very much from the Liberal Party and from the Protestant private schools, was that they were entitled to rule everybody else because they'd been to good schools, which is code for an expensive Protestant school. So your good school has given you values and background, and that entitles you to lead. And I remember giving a talk at the National Library about Robert Menzies, and because I used him in my book on the middle class about Trinity Grammar, and he lived nearby, and things he said about Kew and the special people of Kew and so on. And I was being ironic and saying about the belief that you've got a right to lead because you went to a good school and you're morally better educated. And the irony was totally lost on the audience. They're just sitting there, yes,
up the ruling class.
And I thought, my God, what have I done?
Yeah. Well, that's really the argument that's been so persuasive in England, isn't it? And that why people were so excited. I mean, they're having a bit of buyer's remorse at the moment, I think, over there. But so excited to see a cabinet that was predominantly from the government school system, because that ruling class idea in the UK, particularly in the Tory party, that a huge proportion of them went to the same handful of very expensive private schools, and they are the natural rulers of the land. And I think much as that has been imported here to some extent, there is still it's a much less explicitly spoken position by those that believe in it, because they realise that it cuts against that sense of Australian egalitarianism.
Yes, I mean, the thing about England, it's not just the private schools, it's actually Oxford PPE, and the overwhelming dominance of the political leaders that they've been to Oxford and done PPE on both sides. So that the Labor leadership in the past was dominated, whether a Milburn or whatever, that you've been and done that course. Now that's a particular intellectual framing, and it's a framing which is done in a context that we are producing the elite, which might have common backgrounds, but I mean in terms of lower class, but you're now intellectually formed And the same thing has happened in France with their Grande
Yeah.
École, and where it's a very real problem in France that they have these incredibly prestigious big universities for training public servants and politicians and leaders. They're not difficult to get into in terms of social background so much. It's academically incredibly competitive. But the domination of this meritocratic class is a real problem in France, and it's part of the yellow vests and the reaction that's gone into the National Front against the elite, and that really is an elite, and it's one produced by a government school.
There's a whole other podcast in that. I think we might put a pin in that and come back to it. We will have to wrap it up in a moment, but I wanted to say thank you. And I think one of the things we want to do with this series, examining parliamentarian backgrounds, is expand it greatly. You mentioned earlier the difference between federal and state MPs. We'd really like to start looking at state parliaments with a similar lens, but also doing a bit of a deeper dive than the information that's available publicly, because I think it doesn't just matter whether or not you've got tertiary education, but the type of education you've got in the field that you've got is really interesting. So we know there are a lot more lawyers in Parliament now than there used to be. To some extent, that's understandable. They're developing and scrutinising legislation, but we don't know, for example, how many of them were actually acting as solicitors, how many were have a law degree but were working elsewhere, but also that, you know, an understanding of if you have got a tertiary qualification, what field is it in? Is it in the humanities? Is it something that clearly indicates an inclination to social justice, or is it something that indicates your inclination to developing your own wealth? So these are things that we're hoping to develop in the series as we take it forward. But Janet, thank you. We will, I think, get you back soon for some more in-depth looks at some elements of this.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Janet, again for joining us. And I'd like to thank Maurice Blackburn Lawyers for sponsoring this season of Recap. And thank you, listener, for joining us for this episode. Don't forget, Per Capita Podcast has more shows for you to enjoy, including Burning Platforms, our big tech and politics podcast with Peter Lewis, Homes Not Houses, our John Cain Lunch series and webinars. So make sure you subscribe to Per Capita either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or YouTube. And if you want to get all of the latest news from us, subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that at percapita.org.au. Thanks again, and please join us next time when we continue to examine inequality and work towards a fairer Australia.